Astrology for Divination presents Archaeo-Astrology, The Case for Correspondence, Part 2.
Why were the ancients so interested in the motion of the stars? Why was cosmology sacred to the ancients? Pondering the history of ancient Egypt, we typically think of the mysteries of the pyramids and the grandeur of the temples. But where did it all start? Do we know how long ago the ancients began tracking the stars? Could there be lost worlds buried beneath the sands? Cosmology is the study of the universe in its totality. We think of cosmology as science, whereas the Egyptians considered it sacred.
There's one thing we know about ancient Egypt for certainty, is that they observed the star Sirius. And we are sure when they speak of that star.
Everything that comes out of the ancient world has to have a spiritual and metaphysical base.
The ancients, and the ancient Egyptians in particular, but probably ancient civilizations more generally, saw themselves, humanity, us, as tied in with the bigger environment, the cosmos, the bigger picture.
They built monuments and they aligned them. But what for? And do their belief systems have validity today?
Egyptians obviously had a very different worldview from ours today. They believed in the afterlife and the soul's immortality.
Was it possible at all that they had found some sort of science of immortality, for example, we call it? As crazy as it may seem, they seem to be very, very convinced that they knew how to send the king to his cosmic world. Those stellar gods, of whom the king believed that he himself would become one stellar god after his death, constructed monuments and performed rituals that mimic the events that they saw in the sky. It sounds against all the tenets of our scientific beliefs, but we have to see why they were so convinced. The ancient Egyptians perceived the land as a cosmic environment, that it followed the activities of the sky because they believed them to be running in parallel. And they had reasons to believe that. One of the main reasons was the cycles of the Nile. The Nile was the lifeblood of Egypt, and it performed the cycle, which followed the cycle of the sun and the stars. It's not surprising at all that they associated the reappearance of the stars with the rebirth of the Nile. Essentially, the star religion, if you like, boiled down to one important aspect, that it somehow could help the king become a spiritual being and return to the cosmic world in a specific place with Orion and so forth. How they thought they were going to do it is by looking very, very carefully at what happened to the stars. And the stars perform an annual cycle, but those of Sirius and Orion give us a curious cycle in that they disappear, or they appear to disappear. But if you watch a star over the course of the year, you'll find that there comes a time when it is very low in the west at time of sunset. So the sun sets, and as it gets dark, the star appears just for a few seconds over the west. If you come the next day, you will not see that star. And for 70 days or so, the star has gone. It seems to have gone under the earth. But after those 70 days, it appears by this time at dawn, rising just before the sun, which we call the heliacal rising, whereas the Egyptians call it the rebirth of the star. So in their mind, something happened. In their mind, the star went in the underworld, stayed in the underworld for 70 days, and then by magic popped up again, was reborn again in the east. That's the pyramid text. The pyramid texts mimic this site.
At the ancient site of Saqqara, we find the pyramid texts, the oldest known religious texts in the world. Covering the inner walls of these small pyramids are thousands of hieroglyphs showing knowledge of celestial mechanics and cycles of time. Although we've come a long way in our understanding of hieroglyphs, it is possible that many layers of meaning in the symbols remain hidden.
The ancient Egyptians were almost obsessive keepers of records. And one thing that they observed most was the celestial objects. We'd expect them to pay attention and record. Now, how far back? That's a big question. Well, we now have some sites that go at least 6,000 to 7,000 years before. There's a megalithic site that has been found in the early 70s, but not understood until lately. That has astronomical alignments. And strangely, the astronomical alignments that it has are precisely the ones you find in the Pyramid Age. So Orion, Sirius, the summer solstices, they're all there. It's no more theory. We have evidence that they did it.
For decades, author Robert Bauval has been studying the alignment of Egyptian monuments to key stars. He is now planning an expedition across the desert to a site called Nabta Playa, 100 kilometers west of the Nile and 30 kilometers north of the Sudanese border. It is the location of Egypt's oldest astronomical measuring device. The key to decoding Egypt is in the alignments of the temples, which changed in different epochs to match the majestic drift of the procession of the stars.
We're now here at the Karnak temple in Luxor. On this wall we can see the ritual of the stretching of the cord. On the right hand side is the goddess Seshat. She is represented by a priestess. She's holding a rod and a mallet. And on the other side is the pharaoh. There's a cord looping between them, and what they're doing is that they're aligning the monument to the stars.
We know from inscriptions at the Temple of Karnak that they aligned monuments with the circumpolar stars, principally the Big Dipper.
They also align to the stars of Orion, very similarly to what we also have at Nabta. The Karnak temple, the very center of Egyptian religious activity, is aligned to the sunrise at the winter solstice. So as we look down the axis this way, on the winter solstice the sun will rise along the axis. And in the summer solstice, it will be aligned to the sunset of the summer. So as we have at the Nabta Playa, in the circle of the calendrical circle where there is the summer solstice alignment, here we have another example of this similar alignment 3,000 years later.
On the expedition into the open desert, Robert Bauval hopes to see for himself that these alignments exist in the remote region of Nabta Playa. There are ancient cave paintings in a remote location that may provide clues to human settlements from the distant past. Is this crucial evidence being protected by Egyptian authorities?
It's terrible. Terrible. It's priceless. Priceless prehistoric evidence. Look here. Look here. What's this, a dog or a gazelle? A man. You see the man here? He's wearing pharaonic clothes. It's terrible. With scribbles all over. I mean, the evidence that we're looking for is being destroyed by irresponsible people who are coming here. The site is unprotected. And the irony is that people who are responsible are prevented from coming here and driven crazy with licenses and papers. Look here. Oh, there's a beautiful Hatorian cow. Look at this. I mean, this is an artist. This is not a primitive carver.
Pre-dynastic Egyptian belief systems originated with cattle cults linked to the Nile. A cow was seen as the mother of the sun. Cattle were deified and were considered earthly representatives of the gods. An enduring ideology with Hathor as the center figure. Images of bulls were shown with depictions of stars, and this dates to before pre-dynastic Egypt. Cattle pastoralists were in the Sahara several thousand years before pre-dynastic Egypt. Gilf Kabir, which means large plateau, is another large ceremonial center a further 600 kilometers west, near the borders of Libya, the Sudan, and Egypt. The Cave of the Swimmers, made famous by the movie The English Patient, is located here. Prehistoric rock art shows people and their cattle. Since Gilf Kabir is 600 kilometers away, it seems as though cattle cults were prevalent throughout North Africa in ancient times. Could this be another clue that the nomadic tribes were connected? Could they have influenced the ancient Egyptians? What clues will be uncovered at Nabta Playa? How have these influences drifted across the African continent? More than 3,000 kilometers further west, in Mali, there is a living culture with a surprisingly similar worldview to that of the ancient Egyptians. The Dogon live in Mali, largely in isolation. Studies of the Dogon culture mirror the ideology of the ancient Egyptians with uncanny precision.
I realized through my Dogon studies that there were relationships between Dogon words and Egyptian words, and I noticed that Dogon drawings turned up as glyphs in those Egyptian words.
Laird Scranton's radical reinterpretation of Egyptian hieroglyphs came directly from his studies of Dogon cosmological symbols. Their priests use cosmological drawings, symbols they have used for thousands of years. While it is impossible to ask the ancient Egyptians to explain their beliefs, Dogon priests can explain their cosmology and how their symbols are written and pronounced.
The Dogon lay things out in such detail that it's like having the teacher's copy of the manual or of the book you're studying, with the answers to the questions written down in the back. You can go to a Dogon priest, or you can go to the anthropological studies that were taken in relation to the Dogon priests, and they flat out tell you what their symbol means and what they're, what they're trying to talk about. The general pattern I could say is that Dogon cosmology tells us how a concept should be expressed, how the word should be pronounced, what multiple levels of meaning the word should be associated with, and what kind of a drawing it should be associated with. That predicts for us what we ought to find in Egypt. And so when I go to Egyptian studies, I look at the Egyptian hieroglyphic dictionary or go to a book about Egyptian cosmology, sure enough, I find the same word expressing the same meanings written with the same drawing or the same drawn character, and I say I've got a match.
How is it possible that the Dogon culture in present-day Mali is connected to the ancient Egyptians? What is the link?
The Dogon seem to have come out of a class of priests who had very specialized knowledge and who, for one reason or another, were not happy with the way things were going in Egypt and deliberately left. I would say that sounds like it's true. I can't prove it's true, but it doesn't contradict anything I know. The fact that there's a match between the Dogon drawing and the Egyptian glyph in the context of the same word, pronounced the same way, with carrying the same meanings, is just another level of validation that I'm on the right track, that these words really do correspond to each other.
Using this new interpretation of hieroglyphic, what can we learn about the ancient Egyptian view of sacred cosmology? Science is on the verge of understanding things that ancient civilizations seemed to know long ago. How is this possible?
Very, very close, within a couple of 100 meters.
The excitement builds for the real destination of the expedition, the ancient site of Nabta Playa.
Is that it? Yeah. Here we have this bunch of huge megaliths that were dragged from God knows where and placed in a pattern, a sort of center point of the whole area. It's essential that we do not disturb the stones, we don't touch anything, we just look at them. Because the alignments are there and they've been there for thousands of years, undisturbed, and we can use them to date this place.
A group of archaeologists led by Fred Wendorf, called the Combined Prehistoric Expedition, by chance found some pottery shards at Nabta Playa. They thought that the megaliths were just outcrops of rock. And then they started to realize, well, these are setting on top of playa sediments, sediments that were built up during the Neolithic time. And so how did they get there? And so they had to get there from man. These were man-made objects, these megaliths. One of the possible links to Egypt before the pharaohs is that Nabta Playa became climatically hyper-arid like it is today around 3800 BC. It has not been lived at or used since.
It has been assumed by historians that Egypt borrowed its complex society from Mesopotamia. However, it is now generally recognized that a process of social complexity is not diffused from one location to another, but rather develops locally.
(3400 BC is when you see pre-dynastic cultures building up on the Nile Valley, just 100 kilometers east of Nabta Playa. If that's the case, then a lot of the great dynastic Egyptian stuff we're all familiar with had some aspect of origin in the Nabta Playa people's cultural development.
Dr. Nicole Dueck is an Egyptologist who lectures at the British Museum and at the Metropolitan Museum in New York. By strange coincidence, she happened to be at Nabta Playa on the same day as our team.
From what I understand from her, she also believes that this could be the source of Egyptian civilization.
This is just amazing. I've wanted to come here since the first publications came out.
What are the odds of meeting on the same day?
None.
Okay.
The coincidences for me are astonishing. I mean, last year, the same people, we went to Gilf Kebir and the Wenat. We spent 2 days roaming around Karkotal and looking at the graffiti and, all the bovids and the cattle and the people moving around with their animals. And it's the same dates as here.
These people had what today we would call a calendar. They use the position of the sun to mark the specific days of the year, and the main stations of the year, of course, are the summer solstice, the winter solstice, and the 2 equinoxes. No doubt, they tracked the sun through the year, and therefore they had a calendar.
This structure may not appear significant above ground. Looking beneath the surface reveals an enigma.
These complex structures are the most enigmatic remaining aspects of Nabta Playa. When they excavated the central one, the largest one, underneath the surface, down in the Playa sediments, the Playa sediments are about 10 feet deep, they found this megalithic sculpture. Some people call it the cow stone. It has perhaps a vague resemblance to a cow, but it also seems maybe to have an astronomical meaning because it's in this astronomical complex. And then underneath the sculpted stone, on the bedrock, underneath all the sediments that were laid down earlier, they found another sculpture, sculpted out of the living bedrock, and sort of like the Sphinx is sculpted out of the bedrock.
The bedrock sculpture was carved and sediment filled it in over thousands of years. Then the cow stone was carved and placed there, and then sediment filled it in again. We are looking at 3 subsurface layers of sediment. This is a clue to the extreme age of Nabta Playa.
What makes all this far more exciting is that they also align to stars. And that's a totally different ball game here, because aligning to stars means that they track the seasons. The climatic conditions were very important to them. There was the beginning of the monsoons, and therefore the stars would be the signal to them that the monsoons had started. They would start migrating here, and they would arrive here when the water, the monsoons, the rainfalls had filled the lakes. It was essential that they get here when the lakes have water. It would have been a fatal mistake had they come here 20 or 30 days before the event. From the central complex radiates 3 series of lines, east, and a series of lines north. Mm-hmm. Right. According to Wendorf and the checkups by Brophy, we've got alignments to the rising of certain stars here and here.
A double alignment of blocks, 250 meters long, points to the brightest stars in the belt of Orion. The second line points to the rising position of Sirius. Another long line of stones aligns to the brightest star of the Big Dipper, which later Egyptians represented as a cow thigh or leg. The stelae face the circumpolar region of the heavens, which the pyramid text describe as a place where the stars never die.
They've got Orion's belt and Sirius. What's interesting is that they seem to be tracking them, not just aligning to, but they seem to be tracking them over the movement over a long period of time.
So they knew the stars moved, and they knew that the sun moved the same every year on an annual cycle. Maybe the whole ceremonial complex has something to do with the age of Gemini and transition to the age of Taurus.
The constellation of Taurus is represented by a bull. If we are talking about the transition to the age of Taurus, was the symbolism of cows in ancient Egypt connected to the nomadic cattle cults prevalent in the area?
So astronomy is telling us that there's a link. Now we need the anthropologists and the Egyptologists to find that link.
The problem is that most of these disciplines are so entrenched in their own little world that it's very difficult to move people one side or the other. And I mean, I don't know how it is in the United States, but in Britain, everyone is in his own little world, and people who deal with text won't talk to people who deal with sites in the same discipline.
It's becoming more than obvious now.
I think it is.
That there are
connections.
Connections.
Of course there are. And they're very, very important connections, because there are no other answers, for the moment anyway. And this is as good as any.
Yeah.
Better.
That preface from Carmen Bolter's The Pyramid Code documentary series, a fantastic 5-part series made by the late, great Dr. Carmen, rest in power. In part 1 of this Archaeo-Astrology book-umentary, we explored some of John Anthony West's work in Serpent in the Sky to legitimize the principle of correspondence, which is the basis of ancient Kemet, ancient Egypt, and ancient Nubia's entire macro-astrology. Ancient Egypt had 4 calendar systems that all intermesh together. Perhaps the most important, after the civil calendar, was the Sotic calendar of the heliacal rising of the star Sirius, which corresponds with the annual flooding of the Nile. Therefore, the star Sirius was of utmost importance and centered in all of ancient Egyptian cosmology. So let's tune in now to a mini book-umentary that I made in past, which explores the mystery of the star Sirius.
Greetings, Collective Coven, and welcome to a mini book-umentary about Archaeo-Astrology concerning the mystery of Sirius and the Dogon of Mali. My name is Trey, aka Taboo Tarot Reader, author of Astrology for Divination, and this mystery centers the other sister of Isis, The Dogon and Mali are a mysterious wisdom lineage system which seemingly evolved out of ancient Kemet, and the Dogon tribes in Mali claim that space travelers called the Nomo gave them advanced knowledge of our solar system and the Sirius Star System, which is 8.6 light years away. They especially knew about a dark star named Sirius B, which is visible from Earth only with advanced technology today. How did they know about Sirius B when modern, mediocre, vanilla astronomers in this pathetic joke of a civilization we call Western society only discovered Sirius B in the latter half of the 20th century? You can see here that the Dogon tribal diagram is nearly identical to what modern astronomical technology allows us to see today. How is this possible? Note the denial below quackademic, likely rooted in false narratives of settler colonialism and internalized supremacy ideologies, which paints the Dogon as primitive hunter-gatherers when in fact they were advanced astronomers. Sirius A is a bright star which can be seen in the western sky through the naked eye, but not Sirius B, its invisible companion. The Dogon people knew that Sirius B was very small, but very dense or heavy. Yet its existence was proven only in 1970 when it was photographed for the first time by Western astronomers. The Dogon tribe knew about the existence of this invisible star for thousands of years. They also knew that Saturn has 4 moons and has rings or halos around it, although these cannot be seen without powerful telescopes. Was it truly aliens who gifted the Dogon this sacred wisdom? Or perhaps a legacy of a long-lost civilization? Women's wisdom, matriarchy. It is certainly a mystery. Ooh, who's this goddess? Ooh, this is in fact the twin goddesses, Isis and Nephthys, whom in Kemet cosmology symbolize Sirius Stars A and B, Isis, the conscious, and Nephthys, the unconscious. Nephthys, the other twin sister, is the shadow feminine, anchoring Isis, the divine feminine, in space-time. The polarity of ascending cycles versus descending cycles relates to the context of the precession of the equinoxes. And finally, Isis and Nephthys symbolize the cosmic womb or epicenter of the Milky Way around which all stars revolve. Isis and Nephthys, as twin goddesses, in my humble opinion, correspond to the planets Jupiter and Saturn. The Jupiter and Saturn 60-year orbital synchronization cycle mirrors the 60-year Sotic cycle. Sotis is the Greek name of Isis, aka Sirius. The Sotic calendar of ancient Kemet was 365 1/4 days, centering around the heliacal return of Sirius A. Kemet's civil calendar of 360 days takes 1,461 years to coincide with the Sotic year, aka the Egyptian New Year. The Sotic calendar was in use from at least 4,240 BCE. In my humble opinion, however, it is much older than 4,240 BCE. Think of all the time required to acquire this accumulated wisdom and awareness Quote via Isiopolis.com, as twin goddesses, Isis and Nephthys are often called the two this or that. We often think of Isis as the bright twin and Nephthys as the dark twin. And it's true, sort of. For instance, the pyramid texts instruct the deceased king to ascend and descend. Descend with Nephthys, sink into darkness with the night bark. Ascend and descend. Ascend with Isis, rise with the day bark. Pyramid text 222. The two goddesses bear light and dark children to the same god. Osiris fathered the bright god Horus with Isis, while with Nephthys he fathered the dark god Anubis. The two goddesses also manifest their divine power differently. While Isis guides and sheds light on the hidden paths of the other world, the Coven texts tell us that Nephthys speaks and they are obscured. Hidden are the ways for those who pass by, light is perished, and darkness comes into being, so says Nephthys.
The Lady of the Temple. I personally intuit that the Bone Mother archetype of Eris, aka Pluto's shadow twin, corresponds with the Nephthys lore.
Nephthys also corresponds with the archetypes of the death and birth doula, protection, rituals, shadow work, and breaking generational curses. Those pesky little mofos, but little did they know that we wised up, leveled up, so I guess I'll see you next lifetime. When we learn the Dogons say Sirius B is the tiniest yet heaviest grain in the cosmos, which has a 50-year cycle. Sirius A and B mirror a small condensed atom with its plus-minus polarity charges, which mirrors the spiral pattern of human DNA, which mirrors the spiral pattern of the creation herself. Hierarchy of the spheres, or vibrational frequency ranging from dense to ethereal, manifest the function of correspondence in the cosmos. On a deeper level, Sirius anchors our solar system and Earth in time-space. The Sotic cycle entrains with the larger precessional cycle of the Earth. The distance of our Sun to Sirius equals 1,000,000 times the distance of Earth to the Sun. The diameter of Earth equals 1/1,000,000th that of our solar system, and the diameter of our solar system equals 1/40,000,000th that of the Milky Way. This invokes the sacred number 4 and the fourfold reality of the cosmos, reflected in Sirius, Osiris, Nephthys, and Seth. Kemet had 4 calendars as well, the civil, lunar, Sotic, and precessional calendars.
If you are still with me, thank you so much, dear viewers out in the collective Coven. You may be wondering, all of this begs the question, how ancient is this wisdom about the Sirius star? Was it from the Neolithic period? Perhaps is it even older and from the Paleolithic period? Let's now switch lanes to explore the prehistoric Black African origins of ancient Egypt's advanced astronomy that has been obscured, whether consciously or unconsciously, by the current power structures. I'd like to dive even deeper and level up, buttercups, to explore Robert Bauval and Thomas Brophy's work, Black Genesis, the prehistoric origins of ancient Egypt. This book centers the archaeological and astronomical mystery of the Nabta Playa site in the southern border of Egypt with the Sudan. It's a revolutionary work, not only in that it proposes the obvious, which is ancient Kemet and ancient Nubia were Black African civilizations, but it also shows us that the advanced astronomy was already a fully formed system once dynastic Egypt officially came around in 3114 BCE. Therefore, Nabta Playa is an important site because it proves that the same Archaeo-Astronomy alignments that we see at the Great Pyramids of Giza, to Orion's belt, to Sirius, aka Osiris and Isis, also appear at the stone circle in Nabta Playa, implying to us that if Nabta Playa predates the dynastic Egyptians, then the dynastic Egyptians most likely inherited their advanced astronomy from the ancient Nubians.
Quote, Black Genesis, year 0. We in the modern world consider the year 0 of our calendar to be the presumed birth of Jesus, which today is thought to have been 2010 years ago. This, however, is purely an arbitrary date. Indeed, many other people, such as the Muslims, the Jews, the Chinese, and the Japanese, had, and some still have, other year zeros for their own calendars. Usually, years are numbered from the date of a historical person, either an ancient person, as is the case of the Muslim, Jewish, and Christian calendars, or a sequence of emperors, as in ancient China or modern Japan, where legal documents are dated year Heisei 22. When was the year 0 of the ancient Egyptians? How can we calculate its date? This is where we can note an interesting issue regarding study of the drift of the civil calendar relative to the heliacal rising of Sirius. Sirius was known as the sparkling one, the scorching one, or less flatteringly, the dog star or canincula. These epithets derive from the fact that the heliacal rising of this star occurred in midsummer, when the sun was at its hottest, the so-called dog days of the Roman year. The Greeks called this star Sotis, a name that perhaps derived from the ancient Egyptian Satis, the goddess of the Nile's flood at Elephantine, whom the Egyptians identified with Sirius. Modern astronomers know it as Alpha Canis Major, or by its common name, Sirius. It is the star that shines the brightest in the sky. Its brightness, in absolute terms, is 23 times the brightness of our sun. It is also twice as massive as our sun and much hotter, and its 9,400 degrees Kelvin temperature makes it appear to be brilliant white. The American astronomer Robert Burnham Jr. tells us that it is the brightest of the fixed stars, and a splendid object throughout the winter months for observers in the northern hemisphere. The star Sirius, however, does not stand alone. It is, in fact, part of a bright constellation we call Canis Major, the big dog, which trails behind Orion, the hunter. As the brightest of all the visible stars, Sirius is almost 10 times more brilliant than any other star, and can be seen in broad daylight with the aid of a small telescope. Its color is a brilliant bluish white. Quite simply, it is the crown jewel of the starry world. When the very first pyramid in Egypt was built around 2650 BCE, Sirius rose at azimuth 116 degrees near modern Cairo. In 6000 BCE, when the prehistoric astronomers of the Sahara also observed it, Sirius rose at azimuth 130 degrees at Nabta Playa. As we can see in Appendix 1, in the centuries around 11,500 BCE, Sirius rose almost due south at azimuth 180 degrees as seen from the Cairo area. It is well established fact that the Egyptians observed the rising of Sirius, especially its heliacal rising, since at least 3200 BCE. Because of the effect of precession, the time and place on the horizon of the heliacal rising of Sirius will slowly change. Today it takes place in early August. In 2781 BCE, the rising occurred on June 21st, the day of the summer solstice, when the Nile also began to rise with the coming flood. Of course, this propitious conjunction, the summer solstice, the heliacal rising of Sirius, and the start of the flood season, would have been so for the prehistoric people of the Sahara, except that it was the Playa flood season that started with the monsoon season. The British astronomer R.W. Slowly reminds us, and with good reason, that
ultimately, our clocks are really timed by the stars. The master clock is our Earth, turning on its axis relative to the fixed stars.
Further, the American astronomer and director of the Griffith Observatory in Los Angeles, Ed Krupp, points out that
celestial Orion architecture and celestially timed ceremonies tell us our ancestors watched the sky accurately and systematically.
what we may most want to know is whether Egyptians also used the stars for long-term computations of time, such as the Sotic cycle of 1,460 years. Perhaps this is why the ancient Egyptians deliberately opted not to have the leap year, so that their slipping calendar could also work for long-term Sotic dates. Providence would have it that a Roman citizen named Censorius visited Egypt in the 3rd century CE and witnessed the festivities in Alexandria that marked the start of a new Sotic cycle. This is what he reported.
The beginnings of these Sotic years are always reckoned from the first day of that month, which is called by the Egyptians Thoth, which happened this year, 239 CE, upon the 7th of the calends of July, June 25th. For 100 years ago, from the present year, 139 CE, the same fell upon the 12th of the calends of August, July 21st, on which Canincula, or Sirius, regularly rises in Egypt.
To put it more simply, the Egyptian New Year's Day, 1 Thoth of the Egyptian calendar, recoincided with the heliacal rising of Sirius in the year 139 CE. Egypt was at that time a dominion of Rome and was ruled by Emperor Antonius Pius. This calendrical astronomical event was clearly regarded as having great importance and was commemorated on a coin at Alexandria bearing the Greek word aion, implying the end or start of an era. At any rate, this information provided modern chronologists with an anchor date from which they could easily work out the start of the previous Sotic cycles by simply subtracting increments of 1,460 years from 139 CE. Thus, we know that Sotic cycles began on 1,321 BCE, 2,781 BCE, 4,241 BCE, and so forth. Yet, do the Sotic cycles hark back ad infinitum, or is there a year zero, as in other calendrical systems? Even though the ancient Egyptians were obsessed with the idea of eternity, they also believed in a beginning of a secular time they called Zep Tepi, literally the first time. The British Egyptologist Rundle T. Clark comes tantalizingly close to the very heart of ancient Egyptian cosmology when he writes that all rituals and feasts, most of which were linked to the cycle of the year, were a repetition of an event that took place at the beginning of the world. According to Clark,
this epoch, Zep Tepi, the first time, stretched from the first stirring of the high god in the primeval waters. All properness relate events or manifestations of this epoch. Anything whose existence or authority had to be justified or explained must be referred to the first time. This was true for natural phenomena, rituals, royal insignia, the plans of temples, magical or medical formulae, the hieroglyphic systems of writing, the calendar, the whole paraphernalia of the civilization. All that was good or efficacious was established on the principles laid down the first time, which was therefore a golden age of absolute perfection.
The Sotic annual calendar and reappearance of the star Sirius heralds the new year and Nile floods. The Sotic origin reappearance of Sirius, only at Giza once every 26,000 years, heralds the new great year of Zep Tepi, aka the first time, in which Sirius is at its minimum, circa 12,280 BCE roughly. In figure 6.3, we can further see Sirius culminated south so that it just met the horizon, as seen from the latitude of the Great Pyramid at Giza. Whilst the ancients surely derived implied meaning from a person's moment of birth, however, the advanced astronomy and astrology of the ancient elevated ancestors was not natal birth chart astrology. No, this was macro-astrology related to cycles, rhythms, and patterns of the cosmos during the great year, the precession of the equinoxes, again a roughly 26,000 year cycle, which mysteriously corresponds to the reappearance of Sirius star at Giza at its lowest minimum point. Ergo, to sum up incredibly complex and ancient timelines, the principle of correspondence was the framework through which the ancients perceived the meaning of astronomical transits, i.e. astrology. The reappearance of the star Sirius after 70 days in the underworld corresponded to the annual Nile floods, so it makes complete sense why the ancient Africans of the Nile Valley regions came to associate the principle of correspondence between the astronomical transits and events on Earth.
Quote, the heliacal rising of Sirius. The rising time of stars is delayed by nearly 4 minutes each day. If we watch Sirius's rising in early August, the rising will be at dawn. In late October, the rising is at midnight. Sirius's rising in early January is at dusk. There is a period from late January to late May in which Sirius has already risen in daylight and seems to emerge out of the sky as the dome darkens after sunset. That is, the sky becomes dark enough for us to see the spot of light that is Sirius. If we were at the Giza pyramids in early March and we looked due south at dusk, Sirius would emerge from the sky directly over the Great Pyramid. At one point in the year, in late May, Sirius can be seen hovering just over the western horizon after sunset. In the days that follow this, the star will not be seen anymore, because it is now too close to the sun's light or its own light to be seen. Sirius remains thus invisible for about 70 days until August 5th, when it rises anew before sunrise on the eastern horizon. This first dawn rising of Sirius is technically known as the heliacal rising of Sirius and was seen by the Egyptians as the rebirth of the star. A star's vernal equinox heliacal rising. The vernal equinox heliacal rising of a star is also essentially the halfway mark between the star's northern culmination when it is seen farthest north on Earth and the star's southern culmination about 13,000 years later, when it is seen farthest south on Earth. As the people of Nabta Playa used and constructed the Playa Basin to teach about, study, and employ in ritual ceremony the starry sky and heavens, there were certainly smaller, temporary stone constructions there all the time. When the primary asterism they used to conceptualize how the sky moves, Orion's belt, passed that special time in its cycle, vernal equinox heliacal rising, the time was best to create monumental megalithic alignments that would last through the ages. At the time of the height of the calendar circle at Nabta Playa, Orion's belt and Sirius were separated in declination, and so rising azimuth by an angle of less than 2 degrees. Consequently, they passed horizon alignments separated by only a couple hundred of years. Another way to think of the southern culmination of a star. Those inclined to think geometrically can easily visualize this. The southern culmination of a star, in this case Sirius, occurs when the south pole of Earth points as nearly toward the star as is possible during the 26,000-year precession cycle. This orientation is similar to the Earth to Sun orientation at winter solstice, which occurs every year. On the day of summer solstice, then, the Sun and a south culminating star, in this case Sirius, are directly opposite each other relative to Earth. We can then imagine the Sun shining on Earth and creating a shadow, nighttime, on the far side of the planet. Thus, the south culminating star is viewed at midnight on the day of summer solstice, and on the meridian, due south, just at the horizon, in the case of Sirius, at Giza, at the darkest time of night. We can also see that in some sense, the geometrical heliacal rising of a south culminating star occurs at vernal equinox, because that is the day of the year when an observer on spinning Earth moves from dark into light, just as the south culminating star is on the meridian. But in actual viewing conditions, the sky is probably too bright to see the star at that moment. The relation of Dubhe and Sirius. We can can go back in time to approximately 9000 BCE, when the North Celestial Pole is near the shoulders of the constellation Hercules. Dubhe rises many hours before Sirius, and is very high in the sky when Sirius rises, and Dubhe's inclination is so far from north that Dubhe and the whole Bull's Thigh constellation are far from being circumpolar stars. If we turn the clock forward to around 4500 BCE, the celestial pole has moved so that it is close to the Bull's Thigh constellation. Dubhe has moved north in declination to become a circumpolar star, and Dubhe is decreasing in altitude so that it is at only 33 degrees altitude when Sirius rises, as seen at Nabta. The low altitude of Dubhe when Sirius is on the horizon means that the angular separation of the two stars in the sky is essentially preserved in the angle of their alignments on the ground. Sotic cycles and Zep Tepi. We must next consider how the calendar-based Sotic cycle from the Old Kingdom may relate to Zep Tepi. We can recall how 11,541 BCE would have been the start of a Sotic cycle if it was reached by measuring in increments of the 1,460-year calendar counting method, starting from the one recorded Sotic cycle end in 139 CE. Yet, the precise interval between heliacal risings of Sirius, as with any star, varies somewhat if we consider it over an entire precession cycle. Around 12,000 BCE, when Sirius was very low on the southern horizon, the idea of heliacal rising at Giza was problematic, because Sirius didn't even reach the 1 degree altitude normally considered for heliacal reappearance. Simple geometry, however, showed us a very interesting fact. When Sirius was at its southern culmination, it was highest in the sky at midnight on the day of summer solstice. At Giza, then, the place of Zep Tepi, the precise year around 12,000 BCE that marked the southern culmination of Sirius, was by definition the heliacal rise of the entire Sirius precession cycle, the origin of the supercycle of all the cycles. Further, at essentially the same time, the king of all North stars, Vega, culminated shining down into the subterranean passage, and the pattern of the three stars of Orion's belt matched perfectly the pattern of the three pyramids of Giza. Black Genesis presents hard-hitting scientific evidence proving that Nabta Playa is a stone circle that we could interpret in multiple aspects. In one aspect, it was symbolically aligned to these important star systems, which we will explore why in part 3 of this Book-umentary episode. In another aspect, they were equinox and solstice markers, a calendar, if you like, to track the precession of the equinoxes, which leads us into Nabta Playa's deeper aspect, is that it was an astronomical complex used to observe and study the heavens during the precession of the equinox, a roughly 26,000 year cycle in which the minimum and maximum culmination points of Sirius rise and fall. So Sirius was the star that was the anchor point for directionality to the ancient Africans who developed the advanced astronomy and later astrology that we came to associate with the ancient Egyptians. In Black Genesis, Bauval and Brophy do a fantastic job in walking the reader through a deeper understanding and hopefully respect of the high wisdom
and practicality as well that inspired the advanced astronomy, and then the meaning derived in astrology of the elevated ancient ancestors.
Thank you for tuning in to part 2 of Archaeo-Astrology, the principle of correspondence. Make sure to check out part 3, in which we tie together all the threads of this cosmic tapestry to perceive the bigger picture.